Ah, okay, we're now live. This is David Rovix with another episode of Discussions with David, which comes to you on usually Wednesday mornings, occasionally other mornings as well, but Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, and you can find it wherever you might be watching, which could be on the Facebook page of Popular Resistance or the Facebook page of Cable Community Radio or various other platforms. We're broadcasting on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, VK, LinkedIn, and Twitch. And this goes out as a podcast afterwards. If you look for This Week with David Rovix, wherever you get your podcasts, or go to davidrovix.com. Today, I have the pleasure of once again being joined for the hour by professor at University of Massachusetts and longtime well, Argentinian specifically, and a professor of Latin American studies and feminist studies and political economy, and also from Argentina, which is especially relevant today as Argentina just legalized abortion by coincidence. Graciela Monteagudo, great to have you back. I usually don't have good timing with my interviews, because I plan them weeks or months in advance, and but this is really quite the timing. This is just, can we start there? I mean, it seems like a very dramatic development. It actually is a total legalization of abortion in Argentina, and it's now free and legal.
Yeah, free, legal, and you can have it at a hospital. And, we do have hospitals that are open to the public and everything is covered. So really, for most women, this is going to be a huge change because so far, there were laws that protected you in the sense that a doctor could say that this pregnancy was a risk to your mental or physical health, and you could get an abortion in a hospital. But you needed to find a doctor that would be willing to say so. Now, this new law, the abortion is on demand at up to 14 weeks. After those 14 weeks, you still would need to find a doctor that would say that it's a problem for your health. So for most women, this is a huge difference because middle-class women could always get safe abortions. But if you were not middle class, it was very, very expensive to pay for an abortion outside of the hospitals. So this makes a huge difference.
And they keep on having to mention on the news the only other countries in Latin America that have where abortion is legal, which is, which is Uruguay and Cuba. So it kind of makes makes the case a little. It's interesting when they just have to mention that. They don't usually put it into much context, but
it's the pressure of the Catholic Church. In Argentina, it was huge, the pressure. Uruguay legalized abortion many years ago, and they could have legalized it earlier if it hadn't been because of the pressure of the Argentinian clergy on Uruguay, because we are so close by. You get on a boat and in less than an hour, you cross the border. So it would have been extremely easy for many people to just cross the border and get an abortion in Uruguay. So Uruguay had to wait because of the Argentinian clergy mostly. And there was a huge move to try to stop this. A few years ago, it passed the House, but it bumped in the Senate and they couldn't overcome that. And this year, I think that many things converge to make it happen. The government pretty much relied on the women's vote to access power. And this government took power in December, and the mobilizations around abortion had been huge. And the people in power now were very, very careful to try and, get on top of that wave and manipulate it to their advantage. So when the pandemic broke and initially the situation was okay, but then the economy started deteriorating and there were huge street fights even between the right wing and the left wing on how to deal with the restrictions to work and to have fun in the streets and stuff. So I think that for the government to get this law through was essential at this point, because there's not much else that is falling in place for them. Not much else,
wow.
Really.
That's really interesting. Can you talk more about the street fights? I mean, this is, I think, here in Portland, Oregon, might be of particular interest to people. There've been real open combat in the streets of Portland.
Yeah, I don't think we go to that point because, Argentina has a history of violent, I shouldn't say violent protests, but of protests that involve destruction of property. And the last time there was a huge engagement with this was in December 2001, where many banks were burned down, McDonald's. The police had to retreat because it was pelting with stones. And 5 governments fell during 2 weeks after that.
5 governments in 2 weeks.
5 governments in 2 weeks, yeah, for different reasons, not just because of the protest, but it just gives you an idea of how unstable the situation became. So this government that we have now is a coalition of Kirchners, which are left-wing Peronists, and not so left-wing Peronists. The president himself is pretty centered to the right, I would say. So for them to be able to come back to power after they lost power to the neoliberals 4 years ago, their strategy was that they didn't want another 2001. They wanted to keep things under control and make sure that the exit of these neoliberals would happen through elections and not through a popular insurrection. Because although they benefited from this popular insurrection in 2003, when they accessed power with a huge amount of people supporting big changes to the left, they were not able to control power with that kind of street activity. So their whole, during the first 4 years, they pretty much did everything they could to somehow harness the social movements, brought many of the leadership into the government. So right now, the only people that are out on the streets that do not respond to the government are what we call the radical left, that has representation in Congress, some of it. There are Trotskyists in the Congress in Argentina, in the National Congress, apart from local congresses. But so none of those groups are into the kind of organizing a social movements that we saw in 2001. The radical left is very much now into getting into the Senate, if possible, and if not, at least have a lot of representation in the lower chambers. So there hasn't been the kind of outgoing street fights that we saw in Portland, for example, because there's more representation of the left in power than we have in the United States, I think.
What about the right? Are they also represented in Parliament?
Very much so, very much so. It's pretty much divided half in half. The left is tiny. It only has a couple of seats. The neoliberals that lost the elections last December lost by a small margin, really. And they are very well organized, and they were the ones behind the first massive protest against the government during the pandemic. They are also, it seems like there's some sort of, I don't know, brain thing that unites these people, because they're also anti-maskers. They decry of the vaccine. They are anti-abortion. It looks like it's a global pandemic that we have in that sense too.
How, I mean, when I try to understand the sort of denialism of reality that goes on in that crowd about not wearing masks, not believing in vaccines, and this kind of thing, it seems like they've been lied to their whole lives by the corporate media in so many ways, around so many different things, and so it sort of seems natural that some people, or a lot of people, might develop this totally conspiratorial orientation, but. Is that the same kind of phenomenon in other parts of the world? Or, I mean, can you try to understand where these people are coming from, like in Argentina?
See, in Argentina, there's some of the same thing you see here. These neoliberals, they were very much influenced by something that influenced all of us, yoga, and a number of disciplines that came from the East. And some of us took that, and we became leftist vegetarians, and some of them took it in a different direction, and they became right-wing wackos, because it's not even that they're vegetarians, they are really wackos that believe in all kinds of crazy stuff. And they talk a lot about anguish and being free. There was a famous moment where the former neoliberal president talked with the king of Spain and said to him, can you imagine this General San Martin, who was like a George Washington, right? The guy that went out and fought against the Spanish Empire. Can you imagine the level of anguish that this general must have had, my dear King of Spain, when he was succeeding from the motherland? So these people are strange, they have a different way of thinking about stuff, but I think they are easily manipulated by their, they have like identification with wealth and with the right way of living, conservative way of living, that don't necessarily connect with the material conditions of their lives, because not all of them are wealthy, not all of them own, countryside, estancias or anything like that, but they do have this mentality. So most of the problems came when the government told people to stay home. And they gave money, a little bit of money. It wasn't a lot of money, but they gave a little bit of money to people so that they wouldn't have to go out and sell stuff on the streets, and things like that. So that really didn't feel well with this right-wing people, because they always think that people just don't want to work. The fact that you cannot go out to work seems to make no dent on their heads. So very soon we started seeing huge mobilizations of these right-wing people requesting, for example, that they don't close factories that were clearly fraudulently bankrupt. So the government immediately responded to them and started caboting to them and giving them what they were looking for. So we had the situation, for example, where the government was paying half of the salaries of corporations, so that the corporation could continue to employ people, but they already make surplus value, and we are giving them half of the salary on top of that. And at the same time, there was very little money for people who had no income whatsoever, because they didn't have any sort of formal jobs that they could stay at home and work. And at the same time, the situation became very, very repressive in the streets, especially in the province of Buenos Aires. Several people disappeared. The police just took them, beat them up, killed them, and then threw them somewhere else. So at the same time that the right wing was out on the streets trying to get as much freedom of masks and have people be able to go to work, there was also some mobilization of the left saying, well, where is Facundo Astudillo? Where is this guy that up to yesterday he was just, a guy on the streets, and nowadays and now we don't know where he is. So eventually this guy was found. His body had been moved and planted somewhere else. It was clear that the police beat him up and killed him. So I think that the abortion law came in to support the left in many ways. And it's sort of like how would I say it? It's not cheap, because the government is paying a price with the Pope, who's very close with the government. But at the same time, it's something that, you can get done without getting into a fight with the IMF.
Right. Because that's not one of their issues in terms of
the contrary,
how they want to control everyone.
On the contrary, the IMF and the World Bank peddle legal abortion in Latin America, which is part of the problem here, because we all want women to be able to decide over their own bodies. But you got to think about it. Why is it that all of a sudden the World Bank is so interested in me taking care of my own body when it was never the case? They don't care if I eat or I don't eat. So how come now they care that I am, autonomous?
Why do they care about population control? Is that
Yeah,
that's their
that's very clear. And I did some research on that because there was a conference. Argentinian feminists have been fighting for abortion for decades. So maybe 10 years ago, I was asked to recommend somebody who could travel and give a talk about abortion in the United States. And I recommended a woman that when she arrived, she said that she thought that our focus that was 100% abortion, it was complicated because we were not talking about reproductive rights. So if you don't talk about reproductive rights, then you are leaving out a number of women who might want to have some children but cannot because they cannot afford them. So in a country like Argentina, if you only talk about abortion, well, you're talking about what the World Bank wants you to talk about, which is, solve the problem and let's, have less children, less hunger, less unemployment. A lot of numbers look better that way. So in Argentina, this was not well received because there was such desperation to get this done. And it was never picked up, this idea of reproductive rights, which comes from Black women in the United States. So
right.
in some ways, I thought, are we reproducing, a debate that was solved here many years ago? Why are we still going on through this? But it remained that way. And then the Pope uses argument that it's the World Bank that wants to reduce populations in the global South, that is peddling abortion, and they force the government to introduce into this new project that they sent to the House a provision that they will support with 2 cents the child that wants to be born during 1,000 days. So apart from all the other provisions for poor people in Latin America, now we have a little bit of money for the woman who decides not to have an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So this was something that he could do because I think we didn't find a way as feminists to include this perspective in a way that would have been progressive. So it's been including in a regressive way. And it goes hand in hand with another change that the government introduced from the historic project that the feminist movement had sent to Congress, which is that there can be conscientious objectors. And these conscientious objectors can be a doctor, a clinic, a hospital, and the whole state. So what this means is that in the north of Argentina, which is like the south of the United States, abortion is not going to happen. And the poorest women will have to travel, many, many kilometers to get to the center of the country, especially Buenos Aires, which is always where you can find those kinds of services. So the government did introduce some changes. And the last change that they introduced so that it would pass the Senate was that after 14 weeks, you can go to jail for having an abortion unless, and this was something that it always happened, but there was a provision that said unless your integral health might be impacted if you don't have this abortion. So that meant my psychological health, not just, that something in my body is going to go wrong. So by removing this integral health, now it's kind of complicated. What kind of health are we talking about? Can we say that I'm going to go, have a huge emotional crisis, and would that be enough? Maybe not, especially in the interior, in the north of the country. So I think it's a very important first step, but it's also steeped in a number of complications that are the product of the moment.
Yeah, very, very interesting number of complications that it's steeped in fact. Yeah. And that I'm just perpetually fascinated by the whole dynamic of divide and conquer rule, and how these divisions can they can exist, or they can be created, or they already exist and then they're exacerbated. But like these divisions between sort of, I guess in this situation, between sort of middle class and working class feminism, it seems that is that one way to characterize it, or how that gets divided, how that division gets sort of viewed?
That's a good question. Argentinian feminism was white and dependent on European feminism until recently. We start seeing the first important formations of feminist organizations in the late 80s. But at that point, it's pretty white, and even the white feminists are conscious of this. And mostly because of the Catholic Church, it's almost impossible for these women to get into the popular neighborhoods. At the same time, the left is mostly a Marxist left, traditional Marxist left, with a huge influence of Trotskyism, and there's not much feminism there either. Because if you think about the Soviet Union, for example, in the Soviet Union was the first country to legalize abortion. I think 3 years after they take power, I don't remember if it was 1920 or 1921, they legalized abortion. It's the first country in the world to have legal, free abortion at the hospitals. But they don't do this because it's the right of the woman to have or not have children. It's not a feminist approach. It's because women were having abortions, back alley abortions, and workers were dying. So as a nation that needs to build their working class in order to compete with all the capitalist nations of the world, they need their women to be healthy. And they know that women will have an abortion no matter what. So they move to legalize it. But because the move is not a feminist move, there's ways in which this is done that is quite brutal. For example, women would not receive anesthesia. And we are talking about the days when it was, going inside and just scraping it out. Mm-hmm. Because there wasn't much anesthesia, and they reserved the anesthesia for men who needed big surgeries or whatever. So in a way, this left also has an influence in Argentina, and we don't talk about issues of gender or sexuality because it divides the working class. And it does divide the working class because the working class is mostly in the hands of men who have women who work for them for free. So we don't want to talk about this because it creates complications. And for many years, I myself completely agree with this, because the example for me were these white feminist women who were talking about stuff that didn't make sense in the working class neighborhoods. But when unemployment became a big problem in the 90s, there were groups of women, especially women who respond to Maoist organizations, which are also very powerful in Argentina. Not so easy to trace as the Trotskys because they vote Peronist. So when you look at when you look at who's who, you don't see the work of the Maoists because they're always under the Peronists.
They're not running for office. They
don't run for office.
Right.
Yeah, they might control some organizations, and they do control organizations, but they don't run for office, at least so far. So these women started organizing unemployed women in the unemployed neighborhoods and started bringing these women to the Encuentro de Mujeres, which were gatherings of feminist women that were very, very small in the 80s, but as unemployment started growing and all these women didn't have jobs and were interested in politics and were interested in getting out of their neighborhoods for the first time in their lives and traveling and being with other women and no men around, this is when feminists became popular in Argentina. So there was a huge amount of unemployed women who start talking with feminists from the country and from outside of the country. And that's when feminist becomes what we call feminismo villero, shantytown feminism. The feminism of the women who are really doing work in the shantytowns, who are working in factories, who are working in these spaces where unemployed people can plant and do certain jobs that are later sold for some income. So that's when it becomes very popular. And there's a moment in 2015 when some women that call themselves Ni Una Menos, not one woman less, called out a day of protest because of the femicides. There's a huge amount of women who are killed. In Argentina, it's one woman every 36 hours, more or less. In Mexico, it's 10. This number is increased like by 10 times.
Wow.
So it's a huge thing that few people are talking about. In the United States, there's lots of women who disappear, and we don't even know if they're dead or they just were taken for whatever kind of underground sex trade there might be going on or whatever, because there's no register, especially of Native American women.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a huge problem that goes beyond Mexico and goes beyond Argentina. And it was sort of like a quiet thing until these women tweeted that there would be a national day. And that's when all these organizations that were based in the shanties and based in the popular neighborhoods, they get together. And I was there by chance. I was trying to set up a semester abroad for my students in Argentina. And I said to my friends, let's meet at this protest. And I told them to meet on the other side of the Congreso, of the Parliament Plaza. And I almost couldn't get there because there were 300,000 people.
Wow.
You had to just push, softly push your way, because everybody was once again, and there was no organization because it had been completely spontaneous. So we haven't been able to do much about that. Because for the most part, that struggle that at some point was very, very radical, it also became co-opted by the Kirchners and the government, and it all ends in December this past year with a minister for women. Now we have our own ministry, Women and Gender Diversity, it's called. So some people thought, well, this is going to help, because at least now there could be like national registers. We don't know how many women are killed, for example. Nobody counts that. Only people who do it on their own, media and organizations. But it hasn't changed much, and it became quite clear that having a woman's minister wasn't going to change anything when this land takeover happened in Guernica. I think you had a guest, Dario, who talked about Guernica and how important that was. It was more or less, I think, 2,500 families that squatted very close to downtown Buenos Aires. And lots of the people there were women escaping domestic violence.
The connections, yes. And then they were attacked by the police, and the place was raided recently, yeah?
Totally. So before that happened, many of these feminists that had organized the Ni Una Menos organizations were trying to put pressure on the Ministry of Women, saying, this is a moment where you have all this power, you're in the government, what are you going to do for these women who were told to stay home with their abusers? Because nothing was done for these women. They were told, well, now nobody can get out of the streets. You couldn't even walk your dog during the first days. And we knew that there were millions of women at risk, and nothing was done for them. So when some of these women go and squat on land, they are brutally repressed by the police, tear gas, beat up. It was a complete disaster. So if there were still people who were, thinking, where is this government going? This is a moment where it's very clear that this is a government that is going to negotiate with the IMF, is going to, as we are seeing now, make the population pay for the external debt that they know was brought to the country just to support the neoliberal government. That money did nothing for us. They didn't even question that. They're just going to pay it. So right now, they passed a law where the retirees are going to get even less money than what they are getting now, and they're already living below the poverty line. So it's been a very, very disappointing few months, I would say.
Really, and I just want to emphasize that point because it just seems so extremely important that people understand that this goes on. That the IMF was loaning Argentina money while Argentina had a neoliberal IMF-friendly government in it, so that during that time Argentina could appear to be prospering, and then they get a new government, and suddenly they're saddled with all this debt. And this pattern, of course, has been repeated so many times in so many countries.
And even more specifically, the last loan, I can't remember, I didn't look up how much money it was, but it was a huge loan. It was just so that he wouldn't lose the elections, because that money was all used just for propaganda for the government, and it went nowhere where you could find, any kind of solace for anything or any growth or anything that would justify it. So we were hoping that at least that last money would be questioned. Why did they give him this money, knowing that he was losing, knowing that it was not going to use for any kind of a betterment of the population in any way? And once you did that, how come nobody talks about that? And they're just trying to pay as little as possible and with as many accommodations, but they are paying. Or I should say the retirees are paying.
Yeah, and it seems like the basic question of whether a government is truly progressive in any real sense, it ultimately comes down to the land question, doesn't it? In a place like Argentina or the United States, where there's such incredible inequality and the division of land is so unequal going back to the colonial times, right? And this has never been resolved. And so then when people are occupying land and they're landless and there's no prospect for ever having land if they don't take these sorts of actions, and then the government represses them and shows who they are really working for, which is the people.
And in this case, it was very clear because they had set up this space in land that was destined to create this very nice gated neighborhoods for wealthy people who feel unsafe in the urban spaces. So it was clear that this was, who's going to win here? Is it going to be these people who had the space was, they say in Argentina, week of papers. It wasn't, they bought it, but it shouldn't have been bought there. It was not a space that should have had constructions on. So there were a number of problems with the ownership of that land, but nothing as, important as not having any papers. That was really, really important. And it was really disgusting to see how they were trying to talk people into moving, because, they have to pretend that they are the people's government. This is not the neoliberal government. So it took a few months before they were violently expelled. And you would hear the governor of the province, who was a leftist, closely connected with my friends in Argentina, talking to women with 1-month-old babies, saying to them, well, if you leave now, we can give you a space where you and your child will be fine. And the women, they had talked with other people also, so they were aware of what was going on. And they would say, well, but so I go there, and what would it look like? Well, it's a daytime thing where, well, so what happens in the night? Where do I go with? Well, in that case, I think that in a few weeks, there was nothing for them. They were just trying to get them out of there so that there wouldn't be press, showing that there was repression. But the repression was very, very serious, very serious. And the women in the government did nothing to protect the women and children who were there. So I think that that kind of like broke much of the illusion that there was still some pushing to the left that could be done with this government. And then Maradona died. And that came in like the cherry of the pie, because in the same way as abortion is helping the government look more popular, Maradona's death was fantastic. They brought him into the Casa Rosada, what's our White House, and had 3 days of mourning for this football player.
God is dead, and it's really I'm continuously impressed by how the outside world can look at anywhere and have a completely different impression of what's happening than what's like just in the context of Portland, the reputation that the mayor here has outside of Portland as being some kind of progressive. I mean, nobody here, or at least many people, most people don't think he's a progressive. I'd say, including most of the people who voted in the last election. But we call him Tear Gas Ted, because, but that's not how he's viewed outside of Portland, and thanks to the corporate media, of course. But of course, so in Argentina, of course, you're only getting one spin on Maradona. But talk about other perspectives on the death of Maradona. I mean, this is big global news, of course. I mean, the death of Maradona. God is dead was the headline, and so many.
I always feel a little bit like Cassandra, as a leftist, I'm always talking and nobody listens to me. But with Maradona, I really feel like Cassandra. I have the title now.
Right? Because me too. I have no interest in football. So in the left in many countries, I just don't fit in at all because everybody's obsessed with football in Argentina and England and so many countries. Yeah.
When I was younger, I would still say things like now I try not to say, because when I was younger, I thought that football was a really bad thing to start with, no matter what's going on, because you have the proletariat divided into teams that fight against each other and hate each other. And that's not the idea. That's not the idea. So I always thought that football was displacing the real contradiction. But I was very lonely in saying this, especially when Maradona was playing.
I'll bet. Although this is that there's a book called How Soccer Explains the World, which was very useful for me as a non-soccer person touring in Europe and constantly, having not to relate to people who are really into soccer. It was very helpful just in terms of understanding the politics of it. But yeah, that's one of those things they talk about, the hooliganism involved with and how the rise of hooliganism in England corresponded with deindustrialization. And how this this is maybe not coincidental.
Yeah. In Argentina, what we call the barras bravas, the hooligan is the complicated gang, sort of, barra brava, also became way more violent because they're really violent. Sometimes they kill each other and stuff during the 90s when deindustrialization and unemployment became very big. And in Maradona's case, for me, what was really impressive was how politics and football get so close together that even the feminist movement mourn Maradona, who has, videos where it's obvious that he's abusing women, throwing things at them, who use terrible language. One of Maradona's basic ways of describing somebody who was losing was to say, they have it inside. And he popularized this to the point that it became a hashtag, LTA, the three words in Spanish, right? So a guy who has 5 lawsuits of children that he doesn't want to acknowledge, who took over 20 years to acknowledge his first child born while he was married to another woman. All of that meant nothing because of feminismo villero, the shantytown feminism, right? So there's a way of looking at violence by men where you have to really look into class and background, because it's not the same. We had, I think, a month or two ago, the guy who had been the CEO of Pepsi here, the equivalent of the CEO of Pepsi here, Neus, he shot his wife in the head and then killed himself. So I think that this guy who's ultra powerful, white, member of the 1%, killing his wife is a manifestation of the brutality of patriarchy and, the brutality of a certain class that just steamrolls over other people instead of trying to articulate and discuss alternatives. So when I look at somebody like Maradona, who comes out of a shanty town, my analysis cannot be the same, because Maradona went to bed crying because he was hungry when he was a child. Neus went to bed crying because he couldn't get a second car, probably. So, it's a different deal. So if we study the conquest of Latin America, how people of color were first enslaved and then became the poorest of the poor, and they never have the same salaries as the white people who came with the colonizers, we have to understand that Maradona's life has different expectations and the way that he relates to people and stuff. So out of that, we have something that is developing, which I think is very interesting, which is called anti-punitivist justice. So instead of sending a guy who beats his wife to jail, which doesn't help the wife any, because then he comes out and he cannot get a job. So if he was a bad guy before, he's going to probably be worse after being in jail. You find other alternatives. Indigenous communities, they will give a stick to the woman and have the woman beat the guy up in front of the whole community. That's one way to do it. In other communities, like in Latin America, they go after the guy. They do an escrache. So you get a huge group of women, you make a lot of noise, and you embarrass him at his job. Or you take all of his stuff out of the house, and when he wants to come in at night, there's 15, 20, 50 women who don't allow you to come in. So it's non-punitive because you're not sent to jail, the police is not called. It's, like peer-to-peer kind of stuff. And women gather a lot of power from doing that. So I completely agree with this. Many leftists do not agree, especially leftists who are interested in building some sort of state power like the Trotskys. They think that we should find ways for the police to do this job properly. I think the police is part of the problem. I don't think that the police will solve women's problems. But at the same time, I think that if we just pardon Maradona, because he comes out of the shantytown and people loved him because he made these goals and made them happy, then we are abandoning all the women, not only the shantytowns, but all throughout Argentina, who are dying one per day, more or less, at the hands of former partners, husbands, etc. So I thought that this was a case where we use this model of punitive justice to build a myth, to build a nation, and it's a nation that that has all the contradictions of any nation, state in the global South. And I felt that the feminist movement, especially the leaders of the Ni Una Menos, when they came out to cry over Maradona, that they were betraying the cause of domestic violence. No. So for me, I took it very personally, I have to admit. I always try to straddle between my left-leaning friends who are Kirchners. Many of them were my friends, my true friends from college. We did actions together and stuff, but a huge amount of them support the government now. I was able to straddle all of that, even the nastiness that happened when we refused to vote for some of their horrendous candidates. All of that, I could piece it together. But when they started mourning Maradona in public, I completely lost it.
And so there really was not any space given for talking about all the unrecognized children and all this kind of
no
behavior.
And those of us who came up saying, what are you crying? Dribbling is not as important as abusing a woman. We were called white and racist and radical feminists. So, and we were not, I have to admit that we were as aggressive on our side as they were on their side, but I feel that we are punching up because these are people that are very close to the government. One of them just gave a talk with Judith Butler at Berkeley 2 weeks, I think the day after Maradona died or something like that. So these are extremely powerful people. that are manipulating their own whiteness because they're just as white as I am, or maybe probably whiter. I am an indigenous descent with white skin, not them, but they really bank on that. It's interesting to see how all this neoliberal way of thinking about race and gender has impacted the global South. I'm trying to finish a paper now, and my next paper is going to be about the influence of the U.S. Academy in making Latin Americans understand that they are racist and they have Black people. And it's true that in Latin America, there's a lot of racism, but it blows my mind that we have to come to acknowledge that through the U.S. Academy.
Yeah, that's can you talk about this some more? I mean, I think this subject is so rife. The subject of the term, like the use of the term privilege and what that means, and who's privileged, and comparatively or in absolute terms, and how is this term meant, and what do you think of it?
Well, I hate privilege when it refers to class. I think that we can talk about privilege when it refers to gender and sexuality, because that's something where I can see very clearly that if I've been thinking myself, maybe I should go trans. It would be a lot easier for me in the classroom because I don't have a woman personality, a traditional woman personality. So it clashes a lot because people expect me to be in certain ways and I'm not. So I think I'm going to start cutting my hair and calling myself Graciela Monteagudo to see if things get a little easier for me.
It'd be a good look, yeah.
But when it comes to class, I think there's been a displacement, and I hosted once a young union leader that explained to my students that he had been working with two groups of people in Boston who were working at one of the few garment factories that are still open in the country. And he referred to the employees who were working 8 hours a day, had vacation, regular legal jobs, as privilege, because there were other employees that didn't have vacation, that were only hired per hour, didn't have a pension, nothing. They were just totally at risk. Their jobs were always at risk. So I said to him, do you realize that if you're trying to organize in this factory and you're talking to the workers that work 8 hours a day, that they have a privilege, that they will feel threatened by you? Because I don't know if you're aware, but it took many, many people to die in order for workers to have the privilege to work 8 hours.
Yeah.
So I cannot wrap my head around that. It wasn't something that was just, given to us. It didn't fall off anybody's lap. So if you go into a factory and you're talking about privilege because this person has the minimum safety requirements that any worker anywhere in the world should have, we have a problem. What we need to make sure is that we get these other people those same privileges so that they don't have to feel that they are competing against this white worker. So I think that's at the basics of all this talk about privilege, is a way of making the middle classes feel guilty for what they have instead of empowering the poor to get everything that they need to have. And it's extremely comfortable for somebody like Biden, for example, to talk about privilege, because then we can keep things more or less the way they are, and we just take a little bit out of the middle class, and we don't touch the corporations, we don't touch the 1%, and everybody's happy, because we've talked so much about privilege that the middle class feels pretty privilege and over, getting too much, and feels guilty of what they have. At UMass, the administration separated us when they started firing and furloughing people, because faculty is a little different. If they furlough us, we cannot teach classes. If we cannot teach classes, students cannot graduate. but you can always furlough the secretaries and the advisors because the faculty will do the work of them. So what they did with us, instead of furloughing us or lowering our salaries, they forced us to start working 2 weeks ahead when we are not under contract. So 2 weeks for free, they got us to work basically. They canceled all of our holidays, and we had to start doing the work of everybody else who was being furloughed. So the only thing that we were able to get was that they would compensate us for turning our courses online. By contract, they should pay us $5,000 for every course we turn online. They didn't pay us that. They said that they would compensate us by not letting us teach another course somewhere in the future. It wasn't a very good compensation from my viewpoint, but that's all we got. But this later on was used against us, saying that we had suffered no consequences from the furloughs and that we were privileged. And here were the poor secretaries and the poor advisors who had been furloughed. So we got to work 2 weeks for free. Our salaries were not increased. We did the work of the secretaries and we did all the huge amount of work, but we were privileged. And this was a perfect argument because immediately the fight started amongst the faculty and the staff. You're asking too much of me. You're not asking enough. You're not doing this. You're not. It was perfect. So I think on a bigger level, what we see when we elect somebody like Biden, for example, we are seeing that same stuff. So some faculty at UMass, for example, were willing to have their salaries lowered by 3%. Mm-hmm. Why? Well, because we don't want anybody to be furloughed. Well, what about the coach? The basketball coach makes $750,000 a year. If we only take those and we give them $225,000 a year, which is a lot of money still, we don't need to furlough anybody. But that's never talked about because the 1%, they earn that money. We don't. Yeah. So I think on a bigger scale, that's what we see with this idea of privilege is a way of really pitching working people that are a little better off or a little worse off against each other. And then we don't get to see that Jeff Bezos didn't pay taxes.
Yeah, right. That's it, isn't it? It's just this, it's basically a way to divide and conquer people. I remember hearing somebody speaking at a union rally in Derry in Northern Ireland, and they said the sixth worst housing in Europe is among Catholics in Northern Ireland, and the fifth worst housing in Europe is among Protestants in Northern Ireland. But the two groups are, of course, it's a long-standing conflict without getting into the details necessarily, but it's they're both neither group, they're both some of the poorest overall communities in Europe. Yeah,
but one has 10 cents more than the other. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some among them have a lot more than 10 cents more, but on the average it's really one group has a bit more than the other, but they both live in relatively substandard housing on average. Graciela, can you just share a few thoughts on AMLO in Mexico? I think that's, the new leader. There's been so much going on in the world that even if you follow international politics, pretty closely, Mexico and the political developments in Mexico are not usually in the international headlines. But I mean, for people who have been following Mexican politics, especially since 2006, AMLO, the current president, has been a major figure and probably should have been the president a long time ago if the election was not fraudulent. But and then I think a lot of people who were following Mexican politics back then had a lot of expectations about what might happen if AMLO were actually in office. And what do you think of what's been going on? I mean, of course, there's been a pandemic, which has completely changed everything in terms of what might have been happening. But
I think AMLO followed the pattern of other, we call them pink left governments. They are not really red, right? But they're not also white. when the election was stolen from AMLO, I was critical of the Zapatistas because the Zapatistas did not mobilize to undo the fraud. At that time, they had been engaging in the other campaign, what they call the other campaign. They were campaigning against the elections. And I thought that was fine because you don't need to participate in the elections if you think that's not the way. But I also thought at the time that they should have mobilized to support AMLO so that he wouldn't have the election stolen from under him. I always agreed with Lenin. Lenin said that the proletariat had the right to choose the rope from where it was going to hang. And I thought, well,
and they do have that right, huh?
Yeah, and you do have that right. So I think it's important that right is pursued. But AMLO, the reason why the Zapatistas didn't mobilize for AMLO is because AMLO was a big trader of the San Andres Accords after the Zapatistas spent a lot of time discussing with the government how they were going to respect the autonomies of the communities. The Zapatistas spent 2 months talking with the communities. They came up with an agreement, and then AMLO completely screwed them over. So that's why they didn't move on. So I didn't have any expectations of AMLO whatsoever because I follow the Zapatistas. But I think that many people had similar expectations to what they had for the Fernandez or the Kirchners in Argentina. And AMLO did do some things, but they were all very mild. For example, he passed a law that seriously increased the hourly rate of the maquilas, of the people working in the maquilas, most of which are women, and it's a horrendous job. They have very little environmental protections. Women lose their eyes when they are doing soldering. It's horrendous. So he did pass this law that gave them some more money, but the maquilas immediately took that money away. They follow the law, and then they took all the surplus money that they would give you at the end of the year, because you didn't lose any day jobs, you did a lot of work or whatever. So it ended up being exactly the same amount of money. They follow the law and they screw the workers.
Wow.
So the maquilas went on a huge strike, and AMLO did nothing for them. He should have, because this was his law and they were screwing with his law, but he did nothing. And then his second move, and this is all before the pandemic, his second move was to try and build a train that would go through Zapatista territory. The Mayan train for tourists. So that's all we need, for him to totally disregard the autonomy of the territories and have a train full of gringo tourists come through there so that people can sell them, I don't know, water or some BS stuff like that. So AMLO has done nothing also for women. The amount of women that die every day in Mexico is staggering. And there hasn't been anything done for that. So I think that a lot of people are extremely disappointed.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say this as a general rule. I think people are going to be disappointed of these governments from now until the end of the days. Latin America is not set up to have bourgeois governments that will succeed. There's no way that our national bourgeois will collaborate in creating a nation. They make more money with less problems just by pimping themselves to the US corporations, Chinese corporations now, and European corporations. So we'll just go for a long time, these things where we get all excited and then poof, it falls over.
That'll be the pattern. And what about the elements of the Argentinian left that have joined the parliament? You think basically they're just wasting their time in there, yeah?
That's a harder one. Some of them went to college with me. I have very close friends in that. and I also have hopes. I don't believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat any longer. I was very supportive of the autonomous movements in Argentina. I want to have the Trotskys in government, in the parliament, because they are the only ones who will say the things that need to be said. Like, for example, right now they are the only group denouncing that the retirees are not going to are going to get screwed, basically, with this new law. Nobody else is saying that. So I vote for them in Congress. I think that they are becoming a little mild. I think that now that their strategy is more clearly an electoral strategy than it used to be, they're getting a little milder. So I'm a little concerned about that.
Mm-hmm.
A sector
Very
of them
diplomatic.
even more Maradona.
That was a really good goal, though. That
It was.
Graciela, thank you so much for joining me. This has been
Thank you. Thank
fascinating. I
you.
learned
It's
a whole
fun
bunch.
to talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Ciao.
Take care. Ciao. And if I can figure out technical. Thank you, everybody, for joining this discussion with Graciela Monteagudo, professor at University of Massachusetts. And I'll be back with more broadcasts next week. And remember, don't pay the rent. Mutual aid will get us through. Trust your neighbors. You can find this interview along with all my other interviews archived if you look up This Week with David Rovics wherever you get your podcasts, or go to davidrovics.com/thisweek, or get the David Rovics mobile app. Okay, bye for